it a minute just to let people continue to join, and we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to today's first session in the Finding a Unicorn Small Wastewater Funding System series. Today's session is going to be on the current funding landscape. My name is Owen Volk from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we are going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and any other information that you may need. You can also download the slides and any other handouts in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent out via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. One of the many ways EFCN can support your community or utility is through our free funding application support. Struggling with an infrastructure funding question, falling short on project funding, not sure where to start? EFCN is here to help. Submit a request through the link in the chat to receive tailored support based on your project needs. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenters for today, Kathleen Kirkpatrick, Senior Associate, and Tamira Jones, Federal Grants Officer at the Capacity Collaborative. Welcome to you both, and I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Owen. As you said, I'm Kathleen Kirkpatrick. I'm an environmental engineer. I've been with the Capacity Collaborative for several years now, and have a background mostly in water, but all aspects of sustainability and sustainable building as well. I'm here today, and if you could go ahead and progress to the next slide, please. There you go. Yeah, here we are. Today's presenters. Finding a unicorn is kind of a fun, silly name because we know that the current landscape for funding does feel a little daunting. So bear with us as we go out to find some unicorns and help you find your own. So I'm here today with Tamira Jones, our Federal Grants Officer. The Capacity Collaborative is a project of Earth Island Institute based in California, and we all work by remote. So I am calling in today from Montgomery, Alabama. Tamira is on the West Coast in California. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense for what's going on here, this is a 12-part series, and we really designed this specifically for small wastewater systems, of course, which is our target audience. But we know that they typically have a very limited capability to go after the funding without some form of assistance. And I'm so glad that Owen shared the EFCN help link right up front. We'll also share that again later. So we decided to do this as a series to really walk you through what it takes to prepare, find the funding, put together a good proposal, manage the federal and other funds too, and then get through the whole process on to project completion. We're mostly focusing on federal funding sources, but all of these principles apply to pretty much any funding that you would pursue, loans, grants, what have you. And just to give you a heads up, we're starting today, December 2nd. Our next 2 seminars or sessions will be in a couple of weeks. We've packed 2 fun sessions into 1 week, December 16th and 18th. If for some reason you can't join those, they'll actually be recorded so you can catch up over the holidays perhaps. And then we're gonna get into more of a regular schedule starting on January 13th, and we'll do the following 9 sessions then. Next slide, please. So here's just to give you a sense about the process. And we're following this pretty much chronologically, but trying to provide more time for some sessions where we know that the folks that we've worked with in the past seem to need the most assistance and guidance, and will help you find some resources. So we'll start today with the funding landscape and sort of like get you in the right mindset and help you get prepared and pulling some documents together to get ready to pull together an application and find some funding sources. And then our next 2 sessions, again, those are coming up just a couple of weeks, putting together compelling applications. That's a 2-parter. And then we'll jump back into some really meaty subjects. I'll talk about SRF a little bit today, but we're gonna dive deeper on the state revolving loan funds coming up in January. Interspersed throughout this series, we have 3 office hours sessions. We wanted to make sure that there were times when you could dial in and join the call and bring specific questions about your system, about your particular scenarios, and have a way to just have some one-on-one conversations, or perhaps with a group. So keep an eye out for those office hour sessions. We'll be hosting those on Zoom, so it's a little more interactive. But we've got 3 of those set up sort of for each large section of the 12-part series. You'll have an opportunity to dial in for an hour, and we can dig into your specific questions. We'll also have some Q&A today. All right, next slide, please. So today's session, we're going to talk to you about what's going on with the current funding landscape. As I'm sure you all know, it's changing almost daily over the course of the last year. It's been pretty wild. But then we'll also talk about those documents and information that you're going to need to pull together, any proposal really. Tamira has amazing experience with federal and other grants and loan programs, and really can help you find those best practices and the information that you're going to need, so you don't get caught off guard, because we know that anytime you're putting together a project plan or a proposal, it gets up to the last minute and there's always something. So she's got some great lists to give you to help you begin thinking about the information that you're going to need. Both for the information and then the different components for a lot of the federal applications, which also apply to many of the state and even private foundation funding. There's also some great options, and you'll have a handout that you'll get after the fact in today's session, to where you can find some of that support. Amazing support available through the EFC network. Please take use of that. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of today, and then just some reminders to register about the upcoming sessions. And next slide, please. I'm going to let Tamira talk to you a little bit about how we're going to handle each of these sessions, just so you know up front.
Yeah, as Owen already shared, people will be staying muted until we get to the Q&A session. If you can stay for the whole time, that would be great. And then we can do some live questions and answers to the best of our ability. But if not, and you have a burning question, you can put it in the chat. Owen will collect them, and then we'll try and address them when we get to the Q&A session. We can't see the chat, sorry. These were created before we knew we were going to go to meetings. So, but as you might see, if you're familiar with GoToMeetings, there's a couple tabs in the window, including handouts. So the slides are already there as the PDF, so you can download those out of the handouts tab, as well as a application worksheet template that I'm going to talk a little bit about. It's an Excel spreadsheet that can assist in guiding you through an application process. That is also available in the handouts. The recording will be available, both sent to the participants today, but also posted on the EFCN website. Folks, this is going to be a very quick and comprehensive session. We don't have any breaks built in, so please take breaks as needed. Obviously, take care of yourself. And yeah, we're so happy to be here, and we'll keep it lively so we have time for questions. Next slide.
So in trying to think what's a good graphic for the current funding landscape, of course I thought of a roller coaster. It's been wild, y'all, and things have changed, but I'm also here to tell you that some really fundamental programs like SRF are still here and still very much available. So although it may feel like a crazy roller coaster ride lately, there's still a few unicorns out there, and I'll talk a little bit about how the programs have shifted or are anticipated to perhaps shift. We're still figuring it out. We're all in this together. So this is a great place where if you've seen any particular changes in funding programs that you've been pursuing, bring those questions up, and then we can have more information to help respond to your needs in some of the later sessions. Next slide, please. So these are the big ones, the EPA State Revolving Funds, two programs within SRF, the Clean Water SRF and Drinking Water SRF. Drinking Water SRF seems pretty obvious. It's for water delivery systems, and much more specific. We're here to talk about small wastewater systems for this series, so we're going to focus on Clean Water SRF. These are programs that, just in a nutshell, the state, and it's a state revolving loan fund. These are federal allocations that are applied by the states, and in some cases tribes and territories. There were huge, in many cases, increases to the state revolving funds in many states, thanks to the ARPA and BIL, the really big funding, congressional funding allocations the last few years. And it's interesting that, of course, there's been a lot of, trepidation about the continuity of federal funding and the ability of federal agencies like EPA to even continue administering these funds. And I'm here to tell you that there's a lot of state agencies that are concerned about that as well. But fundamentally, this is a revolving fund. So funds that were allocated to the states for implementation of Clean Water SRF and Drinking Water SRF, it is fundamentally a loan program. So as those loans are paid back into the state coffers, it makes more funding available for continuity of the program. Now, I can speak to the state of Alabama, where I'm located, as a good example. There were huge state allocations. The state chose to apply billions of dollars in ARPA funding and run it through an established program like SRF, because the program was already there and it was already laid out. So that was a huge boon for the state of Alabama, and that was also the case in many other states around the US as well. So that money that originated with ARPA, if some of those loans weren't essentially forgiven, which we'll get into here in a moment, those repayments come back into the system. So there's a school of thought that the SRF programs we'll continue to see, and this is where I feel like I need a little chart, right? There's going to be continuity from those high levels of funding as it becomes repaid, but then there were also a lot of allocations that were given principal forgiveness. So it essentially became a loan forgiveness program to really pump up some of the infrastructure that we know all over the country has been sadly neglected. So those programs are still underway. There's some timelines involved with both the ARPA funding and the BIL, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we do the more specific SRF sessions in January. So just to give you that preview, it's like hope is not lost. The SRF programs are still out there. They're going to continue, and they're there for you to tap into, and we're going to help you figure that out. Next slide, please. This looks really complicated, but it's one of the best diagrams I've seen that explains the state revolving fund process. The source for this is from a training program that's led by River Network. I encourage you, if you're really interested in SRF, I encourage you to check it out. And you'll have this in your handout, but it's a great pathway to how the federal funding flows to the states and the approval process. There are lists that are generated and proposals that are generated by whatever the state agency is that handles clean water SRF and drinking water SRF. And keep in mind here, if you're not aware of this, in some states, different agencies manage drinking water SRF versus clean water SRF funding. For instance, I believe it's Texas. In some states like Texas, the drinking water SRF funding is managed by like the departments of public health, more of a public health interest because it's a drinking water source. Whereas clean water, more directed at sanitation and protecting waterways and wastewater discharges, those are handled by a different environmental authority. So just really one of the most fundamental things to be aware of with SRF is even though this is a federally initiated program, some of the details are gonna vary by state, which can get pretty complicated. But again, we're gonna try to help you figure that out. And we're gonna hone in on the clean water SRF programs in particular as we get into the more in-depth presentations about this in January. Next slide, please. All right, some things to know about clean water SRF. And these fundamentals are true also for drinking water SRF, and I didn't want to neglect that, but we're going to focus more on clean water since we're talking about wastewater systems here. Like I said, I can't say this enough, the details are going to vary by state. Some states are more complicated than others, but it is a loan program, and there have been some really terrific studies released even within the last year about how these loan programs, the SRF programs, are overall much more favorable, especially to small systems that are challenged with finding matching funds or obtaining loans. These state allocated funding programs offer very favorable loan rates for repayment. And in many cases, for particularly stressed or disadvantaged communities, DACs, disadvantaged communities, DAC, many communities and systems are offered an opportunity for principal forgiveness. And principal forgiveness, it essentially becomes almost like a grant program, but the application process is the same. This is where I will repeat this again in January, probably you'll hear this a lot. Although these programs can seem very complicated, one of the best ways to learn about them is to get to know the SRF program staff at your state agency for the Clean Water SRF, because they're there to help you. So yeah, the opportunities for principal forgiveness are out there, but ultimately, again, to keep these programs going at the state level And to replenish the revolving loan fund, repayment is going to be important, but we're talking about rates as low as, in many cases, like 3 to 5%. One thing to keep in mind, and I've had this question come up surprisingly often, SRF funding is for improving your system and ensuring that you can maintain compliance. It's not for expanding. If, for instance, your system wants to expand to take on a new housing development or a new manufacturing facility, SRF is not the program for that. SRF is really dedicated to helping overcome these issues that a lot of our small systems have seen with deferred maintenance and the sorts of challenges that they've had for funding. So it's for system improvements, not for expanding your system. And yes, once again, 2 webinars. We're going to really dig into SRF come January, and do send us your questions now too. So that'll help us be more responsive when we go over this material in more depth in January. Next slide, please. Some other federal funding options, and these are tried and true. The USDA rural programs have been popular for many years for water and wastewater infrastructure. They're still out there and they're still going strong. Leadership and personnel have changed in a lot of states, so there may be some changes, but we're still seeing a lot of opportunities out there with USDA. Keep in mind that many USDA programs do require matching funds, and I was so glad to see the EFCN help guidance. Contact EFCN if you're not sure where to find a match, because they're going to help you track some of that information down. Community development block grants, yeah, and this may be something that is available if you do perhaps need to expand the system. That could be an option for you. And I'm going to jump to the last bullet quickly, and then we'll revisit the congressional allocations. A lot of great funding here in the South, for sure, from the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Delta Regional Authority. I just saw another announcement in the last week. Millions of dollars for small rural systems from these regional commissions and authority, which are federal programs. Some of them require a match, some of them don't. But again, get to know your regional commissions and authorities that apply for your particular location. Jumping back to congressional allocations, or set-asides or earmarks, whatever you want to call them. These are very specific funding line items that are added to congressional appropriations. And there's a very good new report from the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, EPIC, which does a lot of great research about water and funding. And I bring this up because I just became aware of this in the last couple of days, but I want to emphasize this because it answered a question that I've had for a long time. Congressionally directed spending, or earmarks, are reshaping how water infrastructure is funded, and not for the better. So for instance, there could be a large congressional allocation for a specific project here in Alabama, but that takes funding away from the state revolving fund because it's directed at one very specific project, and it's not necessarily part of that system of repayment or allocations that are potentially more equitable because they meet certain standards of the state program. So I'm not suggesting don't pursue earmarks. I will just say that that tends to be a much longer term process. Get to know your congressional representatives and their staffs. And these have been earmarks have been a really important factor for some situations. I know we have some wastewater situations here in the Deep South where if not for earmarks, these programs might not have been funded. And we're talking some pretty serious public health issues that have been solved thanks to congressional earmarks. So I don't want to discourage earmarks. I just want you to be aware that we're seeing a potential trend, and I'm going to say potential trend based on this new report from EPIC, that by pursuing earmarks, it might actually be taking away from these important and well-established state revolving funds. So just to be aware of that, and I'll make sure that you have the link to this report from EPIC with the documentation that goes out after today's session. All right, next slide, please. State agencies are also great funding sources, and I mean, you can always, issue bonds, pursue conventional loans, and then depending on the scope of your project and the actual funding needs, foundation grants are still very much a possibility. I know there are some very small systems here in the South and elsewhere, and with tribes that have actually utilized foundation grants to get projects started, to really understand what their needs are. So that can be a great precursor to some of the larger funding options. And then again, bottom line, you're gonna get tired of me hearing about talking about SRF, but I can't emphasize this enough. The SRF funding does tend to be overall over the life cycle of a project less costly and therefore less burdensome in terms of potentially needing to raise rates for your system. So, there are studies and research that's been done that support this, that overall utilizing the SRF funding tends to be less costly, but it also depends on the mix of some of the other grants out there. So, I mean, there's your first unicorn, a little nugget of hope there, that there are lots of options out there. We're going to help you get prepared to pursue them. Next slide, please. So this is where I get to turn it over to our expert, Tamira, who really knows the federal funding landscape and compliance and how to get a good proposal together, and also how to manage those. So you'll be hearing from Tamira throughout this series. All of these funding programs, whether they're federal or state or other sources, they all have project plans. They all have what can seem like insurmountable paperwork, but there's some best practices to pull together all of that information and get you ready. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tamira.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I get to be knee deep in federal award compliance on a daily basis. So we want you all to be thinking proactively, which I know as small water, wastewater system users, you're always thinking towards the future. And a lot of the work that we're covering is pre-project development. If you could go to the next slide, Owen. So I'm going to cover some basics. This is the introductory session of a 12-part session. So each one of these things we will get into more nitty-gritty as we go along. But the first and foremost, I think, is knowing and right-sizing your project. So developing your plans, developing a budget, thinking about partners so you know what type of funding and funding source is a good fit. Try and avoid developing a project for a specific funding source. The more clear you are on what you need and its impact and cost, the easier it will be to identify the right funding opportunities. Can't emphasize enough how many application teams I've been part of that don't really have a project, but they know they want to go after a type of grant, and so they try and throw everything into the pot and come up with a winning proposal, but it doesn't really reflect all the work needed to develop a really comprehensive project and do all the steps needed to identify the most important things, is like, what is the need and how are you meeting it? Also, don't wait to coordinate with key partners or do public outreach to develop a project. Relationships and partner agreements take time, as should public input. So start now, even if you know you aren't ready to apply yet. I can't emphasize enough also understanding the full budget of these projects. We'll get into this in subsequent sessions, But given the administrative burden of some of the funding programs out there, making sure you're requesting what you actually need is key. And there may be some small funding sources that make sense given the scale of your project. Kathleen mentioned foundation funding, which is great for pre-project development or the needed environmental compliance and engineering reports for SRF. But it also might make sense if you're going after a federal grant program to think bigger and invest in some capacity internally to manage those awards. And I'm going to talk a little bit about like the staff time needed, the reporting needed, the ability to have cash flow for some of these investments over time. Which gets me to the second point, is assessing your capacity. Mainly, I mean, assess your capacity to apply and manage federal awards or loans. Some of these opportunities take hours of review to understand and complete the materials, as well as the monthly reporting or invoicing once awarded. So I always recommend assigning a number of different roles as soon as possible. One is identify an application lead, the person who can spearhead the application process, can gather all the needed info, who can put together the proposal, get people to review it, and then to submit it. And then two, a grant management lead. So who's overseeing the actual implementation, who's able to like judge how much of their time is needed and hopefully paid through the grant, who can really like truth out the true cost and understand the program requirements so that they can actually implement and keep compliant with the program. And then third, I always get people to think about, hopefully these are different people because this is a lot of time, but a financial lead. So the person who's going to be able to do the financial reporting, who's reviewing expenses, who's potentially invoicing on the grant or documenting repayment, who has the authority to make acquisition decisions. This is a really important piece of the puzzle, especially once you're awarded and things are in a regular monthly reporting and invoicing process. Don't underestimate the hours for this role. I spent probably 10 to 20 hours a month in reviewing financial statements and putting together invoices and reports for federal awards. No, I will share the application timeline in this session for those who might find it a useful tool. It's in the handouts. I'll talk a little bit more about it. And then third, understand public grant requirements. Most federal grants are reimbursable or repayable of loans. Hence, grantees must invoice for actual costs in arrears. So there is a financial burden for accepting these kinds of funds and a need for reliable cash flow in order to be able to operate them. So some major consideration for small water systems. There's also a number of prerequisites that pertain to capital improvement and public works projects, such as prevailing wage and BABA, which is Build America, Buy America, requirements for certain materials. We'll get into the nitty-gritty on the February 24th session on managing public awards and also the March session on federal procurement. But for now, I just want to highlight that projects funded by SRF must comply with other applicable federal requirements. As Kathleen noted, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law require Buy American provisions for iron, steel, and specific criteria for green infrastructure or lead service line replacement. So we'll talk more about that when we get into procurement and managing awards. Fourth, eligibility and registrations. All entities receiving federal grants must be registered in sam.gov. That's the system for award management. Applicants to non-SRF funds, such as USDA or EPA grants, must be registered in SAM, including municipalities and cities. There's also other government application platforms, such as grants.gov, where notices of funding opportunities, or sometimes just called NOFOs, are released and applications are submitted. I'll share a little bit more about sam.gov in a moment. Fifth, familiarize yourself with SRF in your state. I'm echoing Kathleen's mission to say, review the current annual priorities for your state, see if your project falls into those categories and timelines, develop relationships with the state agency administering SRF or community block grants. So some kinds can be a state agency, city or counties that administer those programs. And then 6, environmental compliance. All projects must meet federal and state environmental laws and regulations. And that this is something that sometimes, well, for SRF, you need to have some of that in place before you're invited to a full application. A full environmental review is required before funding is approved with SRF. So if you haven't already, identify funding for engineering as part of your pre-project development. It's a really great step. And there's lots of TA available for that, which we'll share a little bit more about. So I'll get into some of the steps for applying. Next slide, please. One of the first and most obvious is gathering needed information. So what do you need to apply for federal funding or loan programs? Kathleen shared that really cursive roadway through SRF. Step 1 is getting on the priority list. Step 2 is a formal application, and that usually includes financial statements for the past 3 years, current adopted capital and operating budgets for your system. Could include bond resolutions from your governing board, environmental review, and supporting reports. If cost match is required, letters for grant awards or other financing is cost match documentation. So, and also to get funding for small wastewater system, municipalities generally need a detailed project plan, including those preliminary engineering and environmental review, as well as a financial plan demonstrating project sustainability. So that financial viability plan, if not obvious, projects must be financially sustainable, which often involves a plan for revenue forecasting and long-term operational costs. So you need to be specific in your budget, not just estimates, but you generally have to document your cost assessment process. So if that's purchasing equipment, where are you getting the cost estimates for those equipment? If it's staff time, what's the FTE? If it's materials, what's the cubic feet? If it's travel, where are you going? What's the per diem? It's really a detailed process to have as clear of a budget as possible. And just other things to consider in that financial viability plan is if you are doing capital improvement projects, so for infrastructure, there's budget considerations for those federal requirements for contracting. So utilizing disadvantaged businesses, and that takes time to advertise and reach out and put out requests for proposal to DBAs. Also paying prevailing wage in your state, making sure you're calculating what that rates are. Buying American-made products can be more costly, can take more time to source and identify and get quotes. So just considerations. Again, tune into the upcoming webinar on federal procurement if this is something that you want to learn more about. And then next slide. Some of the common application components. Now we've kind of introduced some typical funding opportunities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what a lot of those require. Obviously, having some time to review the funding opportunities is really important. Reviewing those notices or those application packets carefully can take time. Sometimes they're 50, 60, 70 pages long. And some things that you want to know right away are like, what is the eligible entities who can apply, and what are some of the eligible activities? So what can you do and what can you not do with the funding? It's really important, and those are built into those notices of funding, as well as what communities are being served. So target communities, it could be regional specific, it could be demographic requirements. So also having access to census data for your region where you're doing your project is really key. Cost match requirements are going to be in the NOFO. Those are typical 1-to-1. Sometimes they can be 2-to-1. So knowing what you can use as cost matched in order to be eligible for the funding. Notices of funding should also include some details around what are allowable costs. There's so many federal requirements around what's allowed and not allowed in terms of like buying equipment versus renting equipment, all the things that might come into play for your project. Really noticing those details as you develop the budget what's allowable, not allowable, as well as what kind of indirect rate you can apply. If you don't have a negotiated indirect rate with a federal agency, which you wouldn't have if you don't have federal grants yet, you are allowed a de minimis rate of 15% now for your overhead related to managing the project. So all these things are going to be built into those notices of funding. Again, ensure your SAM.gov is active. There's instructions there on creating a SAM.gov unique entity identifier, which is required for applying for federal grants, even as a subrecipient. So hopefully you can click on those. And you are going to want to do this sooner than later. It does take time to develop your registration. It does take time for it to get reviewed and approved. Public agencies must register with SAM.gov in order to receive federal grants or contracts. This is required for any entity, including state and local governments, universities, anyone who wants to do business with the US federal government. So participating programs like community development block grants, like I said, even if you're sub to another like city or county municipality that's applying, you're required to have your own active registration. And some hot tips around SAM.gov is, like I said, do it sooner than later. It is free. You need to renew it annually. You may get some solicitations from third parties who will do it for you. I would not go with that. I would just do it yourself. Like I said, it's free and those third parties tend to cost money. Make sure you're setting up your SAM.gov entity carefully with your points of contacts. POCs don't change over time. Whoever sets it up, it's connected to their email, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to change an email for the business entity. So make sure there's several people who have been enlisted in roles within SAM.gov in case anybody leaves, or use an email, a general email that folks can access in place of someone if they move on. Keep your entity info updated. You don't want your SAM.gov to become inactive. It's a real pain to get it reactivated. It is a government maintained website, so it is funky and unintuitive, and yeah, it's great to have somebody in there who's responsible for keeping registration and email logins active all the time. Grants.gov is the US federal government's database for all federal funding types, so cooperative agreements, contracts in some cases, and grant programs. It's really helpful. Technically, all federal agencies should be posting to grants.gov. You can create a searchable, customized search to give you alerts. I typed in wastewater this morning and got 24 hits. I'd say maybe half were relevant, but you know, USDA, EPA, HUD, other programs that deliver TA and funding for water systems are going to list their funding there. You can also check out EPA's catalog of federal funding sources for watershed protection. It's a useful tool for finding grants and loans, and I will put that in the chat for Owen to share in a moment. If you haven't checked that out, it has a lot of the programs that Kathleen did reference as well. Next slide. Great. So I did want to just quickly go over some of the typical common application components, just so you are aware. Again, if you're prepping for applying, these are good things to keep in mind and start to develop internally. Obviously, you're going to need a project narrative where you get really detailed about the problem you're addressing and your solution, a project budget and budget narrative that aligns with the programmatic eligibility and what's allowed and the budget parameters of the funding opportunity. These are all going to be in these SF 424 family forms that are federal forms. Again, not intuitive, but if you go to grants.gov, there's really detailed instructions around how to fill out these forms, and I'm sure TA available through EFC and on how to complete them correctly. They're fairly unapologetically not editable. Once you submit, if you submit something incorrect, it will not be accepted. So it's really important to have somebody review all those forms if submitting for a federal grant. The budget narrative, like I said, is going to ask for very detailed how you came up with the cost estimates if you're traveling or training staff or building or renting or buying equipment or supplies. Line by line details around the costs associated with that is going to be needed in your budget narrative. I just listed some other forms that I wanted to make sure you all knew. There's SF424C, budget information for construction programs. We'll have more detailed around infrastructure projects, wage determination, assurances for construction programs. Again, you're using federal dollars. They want to know how their money is going to be protected through bonding and other instruments. Application for federal assistance is the general 424 forms that you're going to complete that has all your entity information. Sometimes you're asked for history of work performed for federal programs. So what they're looking for is your past performance on equal or larger awards, which again, you can probably seek TA assistance to develop what that looks like. And hopefully helpful to you all, so this doesn't seem an overwhelming task tasks is an application work plan template that I developed around EPA's community change grant program that has some detailed timeline working back from the deadline and all the requirements for the application process. So you can use that spreadsheet template for any application. And it allows you to assign roles working back from that deadline for who's responsible for what. And there's links to sample forms and instructions all the way from getting your sam.gov to submission. And just a reminder, we'll get into the federal application requirements nitty-gritty in the next session. So if you are in that place or soon to be in that place, we'll share information about those 2 sessions coming up. But again, that template is in your handout, so please feel free to utilize it. And next slide. Turning it over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Tamira. Tamira has such great experience with these things, and I know that was a pretty quick overview, but she'll dig into more of it later. So as you begin thinking about, I was like, maybe you already have a project in mind, but in a lot of cases, especially with small systems that maybe don't have a lot of staff, or like you're still sort of struggling to figure out what's going on, you're not in this alone. There's assistance out there, and EFC network is really at the part of it. Our organization, and we were actually, the Capacity Collaborative was formerly known as EFC West. So we've been a part of the EFC network for years. Not Tamira and I specifically, but some of our colleagues have been working with EFC for many years. And so a lot of this training that you'll be seeing over the next few months is based on years of experience and collaborations and knowledge throughout the network too. It's not just with our own staff, but you'll have these links that are highlighted there in sort of a yellowy chartreuse color. Those are hyperlinks that you'll receive in the PDF as follow-up. Look for that technical assistance, and there's categories of technical assistance and the form that you send to EFCN for sort of general help. They'll help you figure out where to go. There's also a link to the page at the EPA website that thankfully has not changed substantially over the course of the last year. There are still a lot of tools and resources out there to help get you started. And this is a link specifically to the small systems directory. Your state and local agencies, they're all on the roller coaster ride along with us. They're still figuring it out too. Some of them have lost funding and consequently, very experienced staff. But it really is worth it to get to know them. Here in Alabama, I'm part of a statewide network of clean water advocates that meet with our State Department of Environmental Management, SRF group on about a quarterly basis. And we've only been doing that for a little over a year. And I can already tell you, it's made such a difference. There are some great resources out there for like advocating around more funding, for more SRF funding in particular, and because we know that that's such a good fundamental source. And I'll be diving into that a little bit more as we get into the SRF programs. But your state and local regulatory agencies generally do want to help. Just keep in mind they're a little overwhelmed too, and they're also navigating this new funding landscape. So, but I think as a general rule, most states did kind of ramp up their SRF programs with infrastructure funding over the last few years. So they may have an even more robust program, more knowledge, just because they've been so busy, allocating a lot of this funding. A lot of the EFC network technical assistance providers also offer additional services, whether it's assistance with like engineering analyses. Some of them have other sources of funding that mesh very well with what's provided through the EFC programs. So just don't hesitate to ask, because chances are there's assistance out there. And I know sometimes it's even hard to know what question to ask, but we're going to try to help you navigate that and figure it out. A lot of regional and even some of the larger national economic development organizations and advocacy organizations and even advocates for infrastructure development and finance provide assistance as well. And I'm going to make a shameless plug here for the SRF sessions coming up in January, since I'll be leading those. So we know you've got questions. We've got just a few minutes left here. If we can go ahead and jump to the next slide. It's all about, I was supposed to say Q&A, but here we are with water, and it's time for questions and answers.
Okay, fantastic. We did have one question roll in. If other people have questions, feel free to share them in the questions dialogue box, and we'll get them relayed over. So the one question that we did have at the moment was, what does ARC and DRA stand for?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, rampant use of acronyms in these programs, right? So there are regional commissions all over the country. Here in the South, the Appalachian Regional Commission covers the state, well, the Appalachian states, and it's actually arranged by county. But if you just search for Appalachian Regional Commission, if you think you're in Appalachia, check it out. It is one of the more active funding sources for a lot of rural projects throughout Appalachia, which actually reaches into Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi a little bit. The Delta Regional Authority, or DRA, is much larger, and that's a reference to the Mississippi River Delta. So very large funding. There are leadership training programs. I know folks who work in infrastructure who go through some of the Delta Leadership Institute training, which I definitely recommend. So look for regional commissions and authorities. These are federal entities that work very closely with states, usually with economic development agencies at the state level, and sometimes the federal funds, and it's usually congressional allocations, flow through these regional commissions that administer grant and loan programs. There's often a match with the Appalachian Regional Commission, but as you've heard us allude to, there are lots of options for matching funds depending on the program and the specific funding stream. A match could be, donated equipment, donated time and labor for some of the construction costs or even volunteer programs. So yeah, sorry, I didn't define ARC and DRA. If you're in the sort of southeast and reaching up the eastern seaboard, you may be part of one of those commissions. And there are others in other parts of the country. I'm just not as directly familiar with this.
Okay, fantastic. So we did have a few more questions rolling. Next question was, are funds spent on TA before the application for an eligible SRF expense?
I think the answer to that is no. There are a lot of different types of technical assistance. In my experience, like one of the things that we've had to encourage our state regulatory agency to do here in Alabama, as part of the federal SRF fundings that flow to the states, there are some opportunities, which we'll get into a little more detail later on, for the state agencies to set aside some funding for like pre-development planning and assistance. But then there's also technical assistance. There's just so many forms of technical assistance, but we've tried to reinforce that sometimes technical assistance is just conversations like this, helping people figure it out before they even apply for the larger pools of funding. But there are forms of like engineering and evaluation assistance that may be included depending on your project. But I think what I'm hearing is, can you use SRF funds to pay for something that was done in the past? And generally no to that.
Okay, fantastic. So the next question that we had roll in is, what is your recommended approach for determining the population that a wastewater treatment system serves? It isn't a readily available metric in their area.
That's really specific. And I don't know that I have a pat answer for you, but you know what? I'm going to find out. Because that's a great question.
I've seen US Census data being used. I mean, a lot of funding does have, especially if you're, the eligibility requirement is low to moderate income, that you are going to have to submit some demographic data to qualify for that funding using US Census data to do that.
Okay, fantastic. We have a couple.
Where it can get interesting with wastewater too is, you may have a small wastewater system, but the boundaries of that system, there may also be a lot of septic systems, decentralized systems as well. And yeah, that brings up some other interesting questions about, can SRF address septic, and that really kind of depends on the state and the state of the existing system as well. But those are the sorts of statistics that you're going to need to gather.
Okay, fantastic. We have 3 more questions. The first one is, where do you recommend searching for foundation funding opportunities? What foundations have you known to fund water and wastewater infrastructure?
I'm leaving that one to Tamira.
Yeah, that's also difficult to answer, because I think it's going to be probably regional if it's looking at infrastructure improvements or public health or addressing environmental compliance issues. I'm seeing a lot of funding for like addressing PFAS and drinking water and wastewater. So I think you're going to have to look at some regional funders or community foundations. I know for the Justice 40 Accelerator, which was a privately funded incubator for frontline organizations applying for public funding for the first time, there was some large initial private funding from like Bezos Earth Fund and Waverly Foundation, Kellogg, and some of the really big funders who are looking at capacity building for organizations, mostly nonprofits, to access bigger pools of public infrastructure dollars. So it's a good question. It's a really hard one to answer, but I think looking regionally first might be a great option.
I think it does depend on your location, and I would encourage you to reach out to technical assistance providers that are specifically working with smaller systems like rural organizations. And this is a good time to bring up just sort of the networking aspect and understanding your whole water scenario, because it's not always just going to be, you know, the pipes and the treatment systems. It's how do you interface with the community? Are there, you know, clean water advocacy groups perhaps? I encourage you to look up the One Water approach. This is a concept that's been around for over a decade now and really encourages systems of all sizes, not just small rural systems, but working sort of across typical silos and boundary lines to think about, you know, regional concepts and who your stakeholders are. And, you know, there may be partners there who can help identify those funding mechanisms or solutions even to help refine your project.
Okay, so before we get into these last two questions, I know we are over on time, so if people have to go, no worries. There will be a recording that is sent out in the follow-up email, so you'll be able to catch up with those questions. So getting to these last two, someone was wondering, can you remind them which grant programs were mentioned that might be able to help them with funding initial planning engineering work?
Ooh, specific funding programs for planning. Again, I think this is going to be very location specific. But again, you know, contacting the EFC network, and they'll know, if there are TA practitioners like us all over the country and territories, and working with tribes as well. And the network at large, the EFC network, will know who's operating in those spaces. And a lot of times those TA providers, you know, and it's not like carved out by state or county. Like in Alabama, there's a number of TA providers who are connected with EFC that are working on various projects, and some have different capabilities than others. So I encourage you to, I do think the EFC network is a good place to start with asking those sorts of questions particular to your location and your needs.
Okay, fantastic. And then the final question, someone was wondering, they serve very small communities with almost no cash flow or ability to service a loan. Many of these communities are very nervous about pursuing SRF loans. How can they help them feel better about these programs?
Come to our sessions in January and we'll talk about that. I know that SRF programs seem really daunting because there's a lot of particulars, and we'll talk about the steps to, you know, you basically for SRF, you have to get on a list in your state, and that's ranked by priority needs. If it's a small disadvantaged community, how that particular community is impacted and what the needs are is going to help theoretically factor into where you fall on that priority list and your eligibility for principal forgiveness, which, if you don't have a lot of cash flow, is something that you got to figure out. But we're also going to be talking about why it's really important to get your financial house in order, because you know, even if you submit a proposal, you're invited to submit a proposal for SRF funding, there's still got to be some assurances that those funds, those federal funds, are going to be spent appropriately. And those are the sorts of like management, project management and fiscal management principles that we'll be going over in some of the future sessions. But, you know, like Tamira said earlier, pull together your financial documents. If you haven't had an audit, some states actually have programs to help you do that. to help get your fiscal house in order, and really be ready to prove that you're ready to undertake these projects and that you're eligible for funding. I hope that helps.
Okay, fantastic. So with that, we will be wrapping up. A huge thank you to Kathleen and Tamira for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We ask that you will also complete the webinar evaluation form following the webinar, as it lets us know about your thoughts on today's session, and it helps us plan for future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.
Yep, we're just getting started. We look forward to seeing you in the future.